let's hear about Bodhisattvism.
Thank you for that lovely introduction, Dr. Chappell. I was not expecting that painting to be brought out. Dr. Chappell and I share an amazing passion for climate action as well, and I had the privilege of serving him at my time in yoga studies. So here, thank you for coming today, and this is the title of my thesis, Bodhisattvism, Yoga as Empowerment for Climate Justice Mental Health in Pursuit of Total Liberation. So my research question was, can yoga support climate mental health? And if so, how? So admittedly, I actually was interested in this question about a year ago, and I didn't even know about the field of climate mental health. I just knew that it was something that I was going through and I was experiencing some sort of distress that was continuous about climate change and how big and complicated of a problem that it is. So I proposed it last year, and I sort of took this gap within that writing period to engage in my activism. And during that time, I found this field of climate psychology, also considered climate mental health synonymously. So how exactly does the modern climate crisis affect human mental health? As we can perhaps acknowledge today, climate change is the leading cause of suffering right now, and it will continue to be so with the positive feedback loops that it is. It also disproportionately affects low-income BIPOC and non-human animals, and this is due to the exploitative nature of capitalism and colonialism. So these are communities who are on the front lines of the climate crisis. That being said, it leads to new psychological issues such as eco-anxiety, eco-distress, and solastalgia. So I was experiencing eco-anxiety and distress, and admittedly, once again, I still do. Solastalgia is a word that encompasses grief for people's lost landscapes, and especially when it is connected to their ancestral landscapes. So now that we're seeing rapidly changing environments and climate migration due to that, and the wars that are being caused due to these climate changes. Altogether, we can understand these as deep existential stresses and grief about our rapidly changing world, and they are symptoms of a larger issue, that larger issue being capitalism and colonialism and the extractive ways that we have run our systems. What is climate psychology? It is an emerging field that adds on to ecopsychology being something that investigated the ways the human mental processes have overlaps with nature and ecology. Climate psychology utilizes perspectives from psychotherapy, psychosocial studies, the arts, philosophy, spirituality, literature, systems thinking, and ecopsychology in order to confront the mental processes which have led to the climate crisis, as well as humanity's ongoing responses and adaptations to it. This definition is from the Climate Psychology Alliance. I noticed that these are often fields that are rooted in Western lenses, and that it has room to be informed by yoga studies as well. And I also differentiated climate mental health and climate justice mental health within my thesis. So here we can see this graph that depicts the ways that countries who have been most responsible for climate change, for example, fossil fuels and carbon emissions, right, are actually the least experiencers of them. So in the flip side, what that means is countries who were the least emitters of climate change are experiencing greater effects, so the global south. And that explains, once again, the frontline communities idea. Frontline communities being those who are experiencing more climate distress. What does yoga have to do with all of this? I assert that yoga is an indigenous psychology. It encompasses a holistic approach to well-being with concepts such as interconnectedness, harmony with nature, reverence for ancient knowledge, and it leads to self-awareness, inner balance, and emotional resilience. I also assert that it needs to be actively decolonized in congruence with environmental justice, which is an intersectional field. Environmental justice is the one that has essentially told us and continues to remind us that it is the global south who is facing the worst effects of climate change. So also, my thesis is grounded within the Bodhisattva concept, and this comes from the Buddhist canon of yoga philosophy. And I think it's really important for the modern context to apply yoga in this way. I sort of see the Bodhisattva figure as a synonym for activists. Bodhisattvas are those who forego their individual liberation in order to commit themselves to the liberation of all beings, all sentient beings. And this helps us move from the individualistic framework to the framework of interdependence, as well as have a grounded intention behind the reason we practice our yoga and self-care practices. So the methodology of my thesis was as such. I broke it into two larger sections. First, applying and analyzing yoga through the various EJ intersections. EJ is environmental justice. And the second large section was exploring what yoga can offer CJMH, or climate justice mental health. So I'm only going to be going through the two EJ intersections that are in green here, ecofeminism and anti-capitalism, as well as I'll be going through a bit of yoga philosophy and research-backed effective yoga practices for bodhisattvas. This is how I feel sometimes. Here's a meme. I'm just like, all oppression is connected. What do we do about it? So my yoga, mindfulness, and philosophical practice really help ground me. All right, so looking at yoga through some EJ intersections. Ecofeminism is one that understands that patriarchy is also responsible for the climate crisis because it's rooted in the division and dichotomy of man and woman. And this has led to things such as toxic masculinity. In the environmental field, it looks like petromasculinity, which is the glorification of fossil fuel culture. For example, cars and car cities and infrastructure. It also sort of asks us, how can we really ground ourselves within our earth rootedness? And how can yoga allow us to ground more within our earthen selves? One dichotomy I picked up within yoga philosophy, particularly the Sankhya school, is that between Prakriti and Purusha. So Prakriti is material feminine, and Purusha is the observer masculine. So the goal of Sankhya yoga is detachment from our material selves in order to reside in the observer state alone. However, ecofeminist activist Vandana Shiva asserts that Prakriti is the living force of nature and the one that deserves our protection today. So for CJMH, yoga would look like balance between both of these, between observation and embodiment, discernment, and sustaining a lifestyle of activism, because climate change is happening. Ecofeminism also relates to gender justice and queerness, because both of them are tools of resistance against destructive systemic giants, capitalism and colonialism. Most of modern yoga today often discludes queer and trans people who could greatly benefit from it. Queer people are also those who are created the infrastructures for activism, and it's really important to include this population. So activist and yoga teacher Chloe Diamond-Leno teaches a theory in the flesh model of yoga in her classes. She cues referring to people's fascia, works with the shape of our flesh, brings attention to the community that is practicing alongside us, and works with a trauma-informed lens. So here we can see how we can utilize yoga for the EJ intersection of ecofeminism. The next one, anti-capitalism, and the opposite of that I sort of look at is neoliberal yoga and conspirituality. So activist Chico Mendes, who was a Brazilian activist who did a lot of great work protecting the Amazon rainforest, has a quote, "Environmentalism without class struggle is just gardening. Class determines people's access to high quality mental health." And this refers back to Jackie's presentation as well. 90% of people with low socioeconomic status do not receive adequate treatment for their mental health problems. Dr. Farah Godrej, an amazing yoga scholar, in her essay, The Neoliberal Yogi and the Politics of Yoga, shows how yoga has been co-opted as a commodity and really an individualistic form of self-care. And we're limiting its use of how it can be a form of resistance to the climate crisis. It's also divorced from its cultural and historical context. So that shows us that we can't even We can't even think about yoga in terms of an indigenous psychology when it's used in this way. Abby Richards, a Gen Z misinformation researcher, environmental activist. I got to meet her at a conference last month. It was amazing. In her thesis, "The Storm is Coming, Climate Change and Conspiracy Theories on TikTok," she essentially researches climate conspiracies and other sorts of conspiracies on TikTok, showed that conspiracies often emerge in times of high anxiety and uncertainty in the world. And because we don't know where we're going to end up in with the climate crisis, conspiracy theories are rampant today in something called QAnon. Yoga is also co-opted by these QAnon spaces, also something called conspirituality. And it leads to fascist notions of bodily purity, optimizing the body, and romanticizing political paths. And this essentially bypasses a lot of climate suffering and leads to climate change denial. In order for yoga to be accessible to the anti-capitalism that is the intention behind the environmental movement, the climate justice movement, it needs to be rooted in both systems thinking and science to be truly a tool for CJMH. What can yoga really offer to climate mental health? So the first area I look at is applied yoga philosophy. So I'm only going to touch on a couple of them. This presentation can't encompass my entire thesis, but I welcome you to read it if you'd like. Ignorance, egoism, attachment, hatred, and clinging to bodily life are the 5 obstacles to equanimity. These are called kleshas, which prevent mental clarity. So the inner turmoil, hopelessness, and dread that people who experience climate anxiety and distress is a klesha. We can also be attached to our own or others' well-being, as well as have hatred towards humanity's evil sides, thinking about humans' disconnectedness from nature. There's something that I often hear, which is that humans are the pest, and we're an invasive species that has spread all across the globe, and this is sort of that hatred, which is a klesha, and it prevents our mental clarity and ultimately our liberation. Ignorance is regarding the impermanent as permanent, the impure as pure, the painful as pleasant, and the non-self as the self. So we are preventing hope when we have these kleshas and this ignorance, because impermanence, we can actually look at it as a source of hope. Climate change is one of those examples of impermanence happening rapidly, things are just rapidly changing constantly. However, we can see this as optimistically, because if we look at the course of history, actually, social movements have been successful, and our efforts are not wasted. When we refer to the painful as the pleasant, we can also cling to our eco-distress. So these are ways that we prevent our liberation, because we're attached to this mental root of suffering, which Lisa was talking about as well. Applied yoga philosophy in terms of loving kindness. So Dvesha is also translated as aversion, as well as hatred. Harvard researchers Dr. Daniel Goleman and Dr. Richard J. Davidson studied how loving kindness meditation affects the brain. They found that people actually naturally turn away from other people's suffering because of our empathy. However, those who practice loving kindness meditation move towards those who are suffering with action. And this tendency increased with the frequency that practitioners were doing this meditation. How amazing. Another applied yoga philosophy is the 3 gunas and the sattvic state. So 3 gunas are the metaphysical states of energy that we can occupy. And one of my wonderful teachers, Dr. David B. Wolf, who was informed by the Bhagavad Gita and Srimad Bhagavatam, in his book Relationships at Work, showed that sattva is the state of being, tamas is the state of having, and rajas is the state of doing. So it's more distressful to start from an internal state of tamas, which is having, or an internal state of doing, which is rajas. This creates that eco-anxiety and distress. So we can actually start from a more empowering state, which is being internally, and from there we can create actions, and then have what it is that we're seeking, which is sustainability ultimately. And the way that I frame this is that Through this, if we practice our yoga in order to reach a true state of being of who we are, we can actually find our unique roles within the environmental crisis. And that relates to the Bodhisattva principle once again, because as Bodhisattvas, we can't be doing everything, but in our true state of beingness of who we are, we can liberate more efficiently and effectively. Here's one translation of the Bodhisattva vow. And now, as long as space endures, as long as there are beings to be found, may I continue likewise to remain, to drive away the sorrows of the world. Sort of acknowledging how suffering perhaps may be endless. However, we are committed to liberating nonetheless. And there's also this commitment to developing bodhicitta through our yoga practice. Bodhicitta translates to wise, clear heart, which is that mental clarity and effectiveness within our activism. So the research-backed evidence that I will be talking about today is my IRB study, which I'm immensely grateful to Dr. Fazio for her amazing, and I'm just so grateful for your mentorship and time that you've spent with me on this. It was titled Yogic Tools for the Well-Being of Climate and Animal Rights Advocates Towards an Interdependent Liberation with the Non-Human World. And this was particularly for EJ activists. I ran it in spring 2023, and the target audience was animal rights and climate justice activists, and I recruited 7 participants in total for it. It was an 8-week study that met for 2 hours a week on Zoom in a spiritual community format, or Sangha. I hand-selected yoga practices for this population, including Yin Yogasana, Mudra, Pranayam, Om chanting, Vipassana meditation, community discussion and listening, as well as Patanjalian Yama and Niyama philosophy. My IRB research was assessed through 3 quantitative assessment tools, the Wagnall and Young Resilience Scale, resilience looking at how quickly people are able to get back up when times are tough, the 3 Guna Scale, which refers back to the metaphysical qualities I talked about earlier, and what state of being that folks are in within their activism and daily life, as well as the Depression, Anxiety, and Stress Scale, which ties into eco-anxiety, depression, and these symptoms that activists and those at the front lines are facing. The qualitative assessments were exit interviews at the end of this research study. My IRB study found that it seems that yoga is helpful to help activists regulate their difficult psychological symptoms. So here are some exit responses for participants. This course provided many tools to support me. This has definitely helped me to remain decently balanced during very hectic, busy, and emotionally draining weeks. Another one said, this course helped deepen my practice of self-awareness and self-study so that I can be mindful of my behaviors, actions, thought patterns that are either helping me or holding me back in my activism. And finally, another one said, it was very helpful and I take what was taught with me, a lot of philosophy that I didn't know and was happy to learn all of it. That one was really beautiful for me because sometimes I feel that I'm imposing yoga. However, it seems through this that people do benefit when they learn from the philosophy of it. So essentially, activists within the quantitative assessments as well, I found that they were able to have greater awareness of their thought and behavioral patterns. They were able to improve their personal care, have a more equanimous, sattvic internal state, as well as have greater confidence and determination on their path of activism. So in conclusion, I think that yes, yoga can support climate mental health if it is interpreted through the environmental justice lens and with proper intentions and knowledge about how to do so. If not, there really is a risk of bypassing the reality of climate-related suffering. And here's my project, Bodhisattvism, moving forward, where these are just some pictures from environmental justice spaces that I've been invited to teach my yoga at by being informed by the EJ lens. And I'm just so grateful to be moving forward to be able to offer these practices to activists. And ultimately, you know, through my own role and through my own true beingness, be able to offer a pathway to liberation and decrease of suffering. Thank you.